An entire family disappeared amid thousands of people in Times Square. During the July 4th fireworks of 1979, David Morrison, his wife Carol, and their 8-year-old twin sons simply vanished. 17 years later, a disposable camera turned up at a garage sale in Ohio. The photos revealed something no one was prepared to see. I've been a private investigator for over 20 years. I've seen it all. But when I opened that envelope with the photographs developed from that camera, my hands shook. What you're about to hear defies any logical explanation. Activate the bell and get ready. This story will move you in ways you never imagined. My name is Michael Santos, a private investigator, and throughout my years in the profession, I thought I'd seen the worst of human nature. I was wrong. The Morrison case changed my perspective on what's possible and impossible in this world. Even today, when I close my eyes, I can see those photographs spread across my desk. Images that shouldn't exist, images that defied all logic. It all began in July 1979. David Morrison was an insurance salesman, an ordinary 35-year-old living in White Plains, New York. His wife, Carol, worked as a primary school teacher and had the most genuine smile imaginable. The twins, Tommy and Sarah, were two vibrant 8-year-olds who loved adventure and always asked questions about everything. A typical American family of the 1970s with their everyday problems and simple dreams. The Morrison family tradition was to spend the 4th of July in Manhattan. Every year, without exception, they would take the train from White Plains to the big city to watch the fireworks. David had grown up with this tradition. His father took him as a child, and now he did the same with Tommy and Sarah. Carol always said it was the happiest day of the year for the children. They would leave in the morning, visit a few museums, have a picnic in Central Park, and in the evening line up in Times Square for the grand spectacle. On that 4th of July, 1979, they followed exactly the same routine as always. They left home at 9 a.m. David had bought a new disposable camera, a Kodak Funsaver that was all the rage at the time. Carol packed ham sandwiches and homemade lemonade. Tommy brought his favorite fire truck, and Sarah wouldn't let go of her golden-haired doll named Lucy. Neighbors watched them leave. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door, waved from the window and said they looked especially happy that day. The day went smoothly. Ticket records show they visited the Natural History Museum at 11:30 a.m. The ticket clerk remembered them. David had asked his children about dinosaurs. They had lunch in Central Park, as they always did. A random tourist's photo captured the family in the background, near the lake, around 2 p.m. Carol was laughing at something David had said, while the children chased pigeons. Around 6 p.m., they headed to Times Square. The streets were crowded. It was the 4th of July, after all. Thousands of people gathered, awaiting the fireworks that would begin at 9 p.m. Witnesses remember seeing the family near the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street. David carried Tommy on his shoulders while Carol held Sarah's hand. The last person they saw for sure was a cotton candy vendor named Roberto Sanchez. It was exactly 8:45 p.m. The fireworks began promptly at 9 p.m. The Manhattan sky lit up with colorful explosions that reflected off the skyscrapers. Thousands of people gazed up, entranced. Music blared from the speakers. Children screamed with joy. Adults applauded. It was a magical moment, as it always is on the 4th of July in New York. But when the final lights faded in the sky and the crowd began to disperse, something was terribly wrong. David Morrison was never seen again. Carol Morrison was never seen again. Tommy and Sarah Morrison simply vanished from the face of the earth. Amidst thousands of people, with security guards everywhere, TV cameras broadcasting live, an entire family evaporated, as if they had never existed, as if the fireworks had carried them away along with the smoke that rose toward the stars. The first sign that something was wrong came from Mrs. Henderson. On the morning of July 5th, She expected to see the Morrisons returning from town with their children, tired and happy, as always. But the house remained silent, the curtains were drawn, and there was no movement. At 2 p.m., concerned, she called the police. Officers knocked on the door. No one answered. They forced their way in and found the house exactly as the family had left it the previous morning. The initial investigation was intense. The New York Police Department mobilized a special task force. They interviewed hundreds of people who were in Times Square that night. They analyzed security footage from nearby stores and buildings. They searched every square foot of the area. They checked hospitals, morgues, and shelters. They published photographs of the family in every newspaper on the East Coast. The story gained national coverage. "Family disappears during 4th of July fireworks" was the headline. Theories began to emerge. Some believed David had planned the whole thing, that he was in debt and decided to start a new life elsewhere under a new identity. But bank investigations showed the family's finances were stable. Others suggested kidnapping, but no ransom was ever demanded. The most bizarre of the theories came from a group of UFO enthusiasts who claimed the family had been abducted during the fireworks, that the lights in the sky weren't just pyrotechnics, but cloaked alien craft. Detective Robert Hayes led the investigation. He was an experienced man, respected by his colleagues, who had solved dozens of missing persons cases throughout his career. But the Morrison case frustrated him in a way he had never experienced before. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, he told me years later when we met. There's no way an entire family could disappear into a crowd without leaving a trace. It's physically impossible. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The Morrison story gradually faded from the headlines. New cases emerged. New tragedies occupied the public's attention. Detective Hayes retired in 1985, still obsessed with the case. Mrs. Henderson moved to Florida 2 years later. She said she could no longer look at her neighbors' houses without feeling a chill run down her spine. The Morrison house was sold at public auction in 1983. A new family moved in, but didn't stay long. They said the house had strange energies. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the Morrison case became an urban legend in White Plains. Teenagers would tell the story during camping trips. Some swore they saw ghosts of the family wandering the old house on 4th of July nights. Paranormal investigators would occasionally show up, trying to find supernatural evidence. But the truth was, there was no evidence whatsoever. The Morrisons had simply vanished. I became involved in the case in 1995, 16 years after the disappearance. A client approached me. She was Carol Morrison's distant cousin and had inherited some family belongings that were stored in storage. She wanted me to investigate again, saying she could never accept that 4 people could simply vanish without a trace. I paid well, so I took the case, even though I knew it would likely be another investigation that would lead nowhere. I reviewed all the police files. I spoke with witnesses who were still alive. I visited Times Square several times, trying to understand the geography of the place. I walked the same streets the Morrison family had walked that fateful night. But after 6 months of intensive investigation, I had reached the same conclusions as Detective Hayes. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Then I received a call that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning in October 1996. I answered the phone half asleep. It was my day off. On the other end, a shaky female voice. "Mr. Santos, my name is Margaret Hoffman. I live in Akron, Ohio. I found your name in a newspaper article about the Morrison family. I need to speak with you urgently. I found something that may be related to the case." Margaret Hoffman was a 67-year-old woman who organized garage sales as a hobby. She bought items at estate sales and resold them on weekends. On the last Saturday of September 1996, she had participated in an auction for a house in Cleveland. The owner, a woman named Ethel Martinez, had died without heirs. Her belongings were being sold to pay off estate debts. Margaret bought a box of miscellaneous items for $5, old pens, reading glasses, empty picture frames, and at the bottom of the box, a disposable Kodak camera. The camera looked old, from the 1970s or 1980s. There was still film inside. Out of curiosity, Margaret took the camera to a nearby drugstore to have it developed. "I thought I might find interesting family photos," she told me. "Sometimes people leave cameras in drawers for decades." When Margaret went to pick up the developed photos, the pharmacy clerk was visibly distraught. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your camera?" he asked. His hands were shaking as he handed her the envelope. Margaret opened it right there at the pharmacy counter. What she saw made her stagger. In the first photo, David Morrison, Carol Morrison, and twins Tommy and Sarah smiling for the camera. They were in a room Margaret didn't recognize. Wooden walls, a small window in the background, antique furniture. But that wasn't all. There were 27 photos on the roll, all of them of the Morrison family. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The photos appeared to have been taken in sequence, as if someone were documenting something. In the second photo, the family was still smiling, but David looked slightly tense. In the third, Carol held the children protectively. In the fourth, Tommy was crying. In the fifth, Sarah stared at something out of frame with an expression of pure terror. I caught the first flight to Ohio. Margaret welcomed me into her home, a small residence in the suburbs of Akron. She had spread out all the photographs on the kitchen table. When I saw them, I felt a chill down my spine like nothing I'd ever experienced. The images told a story no one should have to see. A story that challenged everything we knew about the Morrison family's disappearance. The first photos showed the family in what appeared to be a basement or cellar. The walls were made of raw wood, and there was a small window near the ceiling that let in little natural light. David, Carol, and the children were sitting on an old bed, looking directly at the photographer. In the initial photos, they appeared confused, but not necessarily panicked. David had his arm around Carol, and the children were between them. But as the photos progressed, the situation changed dramatically. In photo 8, Carol was visibly distressed. In photo 12, David appeared to be screaming. His mouth was open, veins bulging in his neck. In photo 15, the children were clinging to each other, their faces wet with tears. In photo 18, there were signs that they had tried to hide. They were pushed against the back wall, David with his arms outstretched, trying to protect the family. Photo 23 was the most disturbing. It showed only Tommy, alone in bed, staring directly at the camera. His eyes seemed glassy, as if he weren't really there, as if his mind had tuned out everything around him. The other photos showed Carol and Sarah in different corners of the room. David was partially visible in one, but he was out of focus, as if he were moving quickly when the photo was taken. The last photo, number 27, was almost completely dark. I could make out only outlines, human forms that might have been the Morrison family, but it was impossible to be sure. There was writing on the back of this photo, not in David's or Carol's handwriting, which I recognized from the documents I'd studied. It was hurried, almost scrawled. "They know. They can't come back, ever." I took the photographs for forensic analysis. Experts confirmed they were authentic. There were no signs of manipulation or forgery. The film was indeed a Kodak funsaver, produced between 1978 and 1981. The quality of the processing indicated the photos had been taken at the time indicated. Most importantly, facial analysis confirmed with 97% certainty that the people in the photos were indeed David, Carol, Tommy, and Sarah Morrison. But who took the photos, and where? I hired site analysis experts to study the environment depicted in the images. The basement or cellar had specific characteristics: woodwork, window pattern, furniture style. After weeks of research, we came to a disturbing conclusion. The location appeared to be a rural property, likely in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. Investigating Ethel Martinez, the deceased woman who owned the camera, revealed further mysteries. Ethel had been married to a man named Frank Martinez, who died in 1983. Frank had a small cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, exactly in the region we identified in the photographs. The cabin had been sold after his death, but records showed that Frank occasionally rented it to hunters and vacationing families during the 1970s and 1980s. I drove to the Adirondacks in the winter of 1997. The cabin that once belonged to Frank Martinez had been demolished in 1991, but I spoke with old neighbors. One of them, a gentleman named Earl Thompson, remembered Frank Martinez. He was a strange man, Earl told me, very secretive. Sometimes I'd see lights on in his cabin at night, even when there was supposedly no one there. Once, in the summer of '79, I heard screams coming from that direction. But when I checked the next day, Frank said no one was there. Earl Thompson gave me a piece of information that chilled my blood. I remember one particular 4th of July. I think it was in '79. I was at a party here in the neighborhood when we saw Frank coming back from town with people. It was dark, but it looked like a family, a man, a woman, 2 children. I thought they were tourists he'd rented the cabin from, but I never saw them leave. And Frank was strange after that, more reserved than usual. Weeks later, when I asked about the tourists, he said he didn't know what I was talking about. We've never been able to prove what really happened to the Morrison family that night of July 4th, 1979. Frank Martinez died, taking his secrets to the grave. Ethel Martinez, his widow, apparently never knew about the camera or its macabre contents. The photos were hidden in a drawer for nearly 2 decades until Margaret Hoffman stumbled upon them. What do you think really happened to the Morrison family? Leave your theory in the comments. The investigation into Frank Martinez's past revealed a man who had lived multiple lives. Military records showed he served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970, part of a psychological operations unit that specialized in interrogation techniques. After returning home, he worked briefly for a private security company before purchasing the isolated cabin in 1975. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, someone who kept to himself and rarely engaged in community activities. What troubled me most was discovering that Frank Martinez wasn't his real name. Birth records showed he was born Francis Miguel Herrera in El Paso, Texas in 1945. He legally changed his name in 1974, shortly before moving to the Adirondacks. The timing wasn't coincidental. I found military psychiatric reports indicating that Francis Herrera had been diagnosed with severe PTSD and antisocial tendencies during his final months in Vietnam. He had been quietly discharged and recommended for ongoing psychological treatment. The psychiatric reports painted a disturbing picture. Francis had been involved in several incidents during his time in Southeast Asia that had been classified and buried in military files. His commanding officer noted concerning behavior patterns and an unhealthy fascination with control and submission. There were allegations of unauthorized interrogations and suspected violations of the Geneva Convention, but charges were never filed. The military simply wanted him gone, quietly and permanently. I managed to track down Dr. Rebecca Chen, a psychiatrist who had treated Francis Herrera briefly in 1973. She was retired and living in Saratoga Springs, reluctant to discuss her former patient due to confidentiality concerns. But when I showed her the photographs from the camera, her face went pale. "I remember Francis," she said quietly. "He was one of the most disturbing cases I encountered in 40 years of practice. He had developed what he called collection fantasies, elaborate scenarios where he would acquire and control families." Dr. Chen's notes, which she allowed me to review under strict confidentiality agreements, revealed Francis Herrera's deep psychological disturbances. He had confessed to stalking several families during 1973 and 1974, following them to malls, parks, and public events. He would take photographs from a distance and create detailed files about their routines and habits. He was looking for the perfect family, Dr. Chen explained, one that met his specific criteria: attractive parents, well-behaved children, stable middle-class lifestyle. The doctor had recommended immediate hospitalization, but Frances had stopped attending sessions after only 6 appointments. She lost track of him until reading about Frank Martinez's death in 1983. "I always wondered what happened to him," she told me, "and I always feared he might act on his fantasies." The timing of his name change and relocation to an isolated mountain cabin now made perfect sense. He had been planning something for years. Returning to the photographs with this new information, I began to see them differently. The progression wasn't random. It was methodical, calculated. Someone was documenting a process. The early photos showed the family confused but relatively calm, suggesting they might have been told they were being rescued or helped after becoming separated in the crowd. The later photos revealed the horrible realization that they were trapped with someone who had no intention of letting them go. I hired a forensic photographer to analyze the images more carefully. Using advanced digital enhancement techniques available in 1997, we were able to extract details that weren't visible to the naked eye. In photo number 19, there was a reflection in David Morrison's glasses, the faint outline of someone holding the camera. The figure appeared to be wearing what looked like military fatigues. In photo 23, the one showing Tommy alone with vacant eyes, we could see scratch marks on the wooden wall behind him, as if fingernails had clawed desperately at the wood. Most disturbing was what we found in the final photograph, number 27. Using light enhancement software, we could make out more details in the darkness. There were 4 shapes on the floor of the cabin, motionless, and standing above them, barely visible, was a 5th figure. Tall, thin, facing away from the camera, the posture suggested someone looking down at his handiwork, perhaps admiring what he had accomplished. The timestamp on the camera indicated this final photo was taken 3 days after the first one. Armed with this evidence, I contacted the FBI. The case was reopened as a federal investigation due to the interstate nature of the kidnapping. Agent Sarah Martinez, no relation to Frank Martinez, was assigned as lead investigator. She was young, ambitious, and fascinated by cold cases. Together, we began the process of exhuming every piece of evidence from the original investigation and cross-referencing it with what we had discovered about Francis Herrera. The FBI's resources allowed us to dig deeper into Francis's activities during the late 1970s. Credit card records showed he had made several trips to New York City in the months leading up to July 4, 1979. Hotel receipts placed him in Manhattan on 3 separate occasions between March and June of that year. Security footage from the hotel lobby, which had been archived but never reviewed in connection to the Morrison case, showed a man matching Francis's description, checking in each time with different names. Agent Martinez discovered that Francis had been conducting surveillance on multiple families in the New York area. We found storage unit records indicating he had rented space in White Plains under a false name. When we finally located and opened the unit in 1998, it contained hundreds of photographs of different families, detailed notes about their routines, maps of their neighborhoods, and disturbing sketches of cabin layouts and restraint systems. Among these materials was a complete file on the Morrison family dating back to 1977. The Morrison file was the most comprehensive. Francis had been watching them for over 2 years. He had photographs of their previous July 4th celebrations, notes about the children's school schedules, details about David's work routine, even Carol's grocery shopping habits. He had identified their pattern of attending the fireworks in Times Square every year and had developed an elaborate plan to intercept them during the chaos and confusion of the celebration. What we discovered next changed everything we thought we knew about that night in 1979. Francis hadn't acted alone. Credit card records and hotel receipts showed he had been accompanied by someone on his final trip to New York. The signature on the hotel registry was illegible, but handwriting analysis suggested it might have been a woman. Security footage from July 3, 1979, showed Francis entering the hotel with a female companion. Average height, brown hair, approximately 30-35 years old. This revelation opened an entirely new line of investigation. Who was Francis's accomplice? How had they managed to separate the Morrison family from the crowd without anyone noticing? And most importantly, was this woman still alive and potentially willing to talk about what happened that night? Agent Martinez and I spent months tracking down every woman who had been connected to Francis Herrera during his time in the Adirondacks. But we came up empty. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, the Morrisons' elderly neighbor who had moved to Florida, contacted me in late 1998 after seeing a television documentary about the case. She remembered something she had never told police. A woman who had knocked on her door 3 days before the Morrison family disappeared. The woman claimed to be conducting a survey about neighborhood safety and asked detailed questions about the Morrison family's routines, including whether they had any vacation plans. Mrs. Henderson described the woman as pleasant but oddly persistent, asking follow-up questions that seemed unnecessary for a simple survey. She had shoulder-length brown hair, wore thick glasses, and spoke with what sounded like a slight southern accent. Most significantly, Mrs. Henderson remembered the woman asking specifically about the Morrison family's July 4th traditions. At the time, it had seemed like innocent small talk. Now, it appeared to be reconnaissance. Using Mrs. Henderson's description, FBI sketch artists created a composite image of the mystery woman. We distributed it to law enforcement agencies across the Southeast, hoping someone might recognize her. 3 months later, we got a hit. A retired police officer in Atlanta identified the woman as someone he had questioned in connection with a missing persons case in 1981. Her name was Linda Sue Watson, and she had disappeared herself shortly after being interviewed about the disappearance of a local businessman. The web of connections was becoming clearer, but also more disturbing. Linda Sue Watson had a history of involvement with men who committed violent crimes. She had been married to a convicted kidnapper in the early 1970s and had been suspected of acting as an accomplice in several cases, though charges were never filed. After her husband's death in prison in 1976, she had apparently continued this pattern, seeking out dangerous men and helping them plan and execute their crimes. FBI profilers theorized that Linda and Francis had met through some kind of underground network of individuals with violent fantasies. The late 1970s were a time when such networks were beginning to form, often through classified ads in underground magazines or through contacts made in psychiatric facilities. Linda appeared to be what profilers called a facilitator, someone who helped violent offenders identify targets and plan crimes, but rarely participated directly in the violence itself. This theory explained how the Morrison family had been separated from the crowd so efficiently. While Francis created some kind of distraction or emergency situation, Linda could have approached the family as a concerned citizen, offering to help them reach safety. In the chaos of a major public event, with thousands of people moving in different directions, it would have been easy to lead the family away from the main crowd toward a waiting vehicle. The final piece of the puzzle came in 1999, 2 decades after the Morrison family's disappearance. A construction crew renovating an old warehouse in Queens discovered a hidden compartment containing documents and personal items that had been sealed since the early 1980s. Among these items were David Morrison's wallet, Carol's purse, and the children's belongings from that fateful July 4th night. Also found were detailed photographs of the warehouse interior that had been modified to create a temporary holding area. The documents revealed the horrifying scope of Francis and Linda's plan. They had intended to keep the Morrison family alive for an extended period, using them as subjects for Francis's psychological experiments. The warehouse served as a staging area where they could be held immediately after being taken from Times Square, before being transported to the mountain cabin for the final phase of Francis's fantasy. Among the papers was a journal written in Linda's handwriting, documenting the first 3 days of the Morrison family's captivity. The entries described the family's gradual realization of their situation, their attempts to escape, and their growing desperation as they understood that no one was coming to rescue them. The final entry, dated July 7, 1979, simply stated, "F says it's time to go to the mountain. They understand now that they belong to us." Reading Linda's journal was like descending into the mind of someone completely detached from human empathy. Her entries described the Morrison family's suffering with clinical detachment, as if she were documenting laboratory experiments rather than witnessing the torture of innocent people. She wrote about how David had initially tried to negotiate with them, offering money, promising silence, pleading for his children's safety. Carol had spent hours crying silently, trying to comfort Tommy and Sarah while hiding her own terror. The journal revealed details that the photographs couldn't capture. Linda documented how the family had been told different stories to maintain compliance. First, that they were being protected from a terrorist threat at Times Square, then that they were witnesses to a crime and needed to be kept safe until the perpetrators were caught. By the 3rd day, when these lies could no longer be sustained, Francis had dropped all pretense. The family finally understood they were never going home. What haunted me most about Linda's writing was her fascination with the children's reactions. She described in disturbing detail how Tommy had initially tried to protect his sister, standing between her and their captors whenever they entered the room. Sarah had created an imaginary world where their parents were just playing a game and would take them home soon. Linda seemed particularly interested in the moment when each child realized the truth. She called it the breaking point and described it as beautiful in its purity. Agent Martinez and I decided to visit the warehouse location in Queens. The building had been converted into luxury lofts, but the basement area where the hidden compartment was found remained largely unchanged. Standing in that space, knowing what had happened there 20 years earlier, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The original concrete walls still bore faint scratches that could have been made by fingernails. In one corner, we found what appeared to be old stains that had never been completely cleaned. The warehouse discovery led us to examine other properties that Francis and Linda might have used. Financial records showed that Francis had rented storage units and safe houses across 3 states during the late 1970s. Most had been emptied decades ago, but we managed to locate 2 facilities that still contained materials from that period. What we found suggested that the Morrison family wasn't their first victim. In a storage unit in Albany, we discovered files on at least 6 other families that Francis had surveilled between 1975 and 1979. The documentation was just as thorough as what we'd found for the Morrisons: photographs, schedules, detailed notes about routines and vulnerabilities. 3 of these families had been reported missing during those years, cases that had gone cold and been forgotten by everyone except the relatives who never stopped searching for answers. The Brennan family from Syracuse had disappeared during a camping trip in 1976. The Kowalski family from Buffalo had vanished while attending a county fair in 1977. The Chen family from Rochester had been last seen leaving their home for a day trip to Niagara Falls in 1978. All were middle-class families with young children. All had disappeared without leaving any trace. Until now, no one had connected these cases. Agent Martinez immediately contacted the FBI's Cold Case Division. A task force was assembled to investigate what appeared to be a serial kidnapping operation that had been active for at least 4 years. The scope was staggering. We were potentially looking at the disappearances of over 20 people, including multiple children. The Morrison case, which had consumed my life for 3 years, was apparently just one chapter in a much larger and more horrific story. The breakthrough in understanding Francis and Linda's operation came from an unexpected source. In 2000, while reviewing evidence from the Albany storage unit, a forensic accountant noticed patterns in Francis's financial transactions that suggested he hadn't been acting alone beyond just Linda's involvement. Money had been flowing into accounts from sources that couldn't be traced to his veterans' benefits or any legitimate employment. Someone had been funding their activities. Further investigation revealed that Francis and Linda were part of what the FBI would later classify as one of the first organized networks of violent offenders in American history. This wasn't just two disturbed individuals acting on shared fantasies. It was a coordinated operation involving multiple participants across several states. Francis and Linda were the acquisition team, responsible for identifying and capturing targets. Others in the network served different functions. We discovered evidence of at least 3 other safe houses that had been used to hold victims for extended periods. Medical records suggested that someone with pharmaceutical knowledge had been involved, providing drugs to keep victims compliant during transportation and initial captivity. Financial records indicated that someone with significant resources had been funding the operation and potentially purchasing victims from the acquisition teams. The most disturbing revelation came when we learned about the documentation team. Linda's journal was just one part of an extensive record-keeping system. The network had been creating detailed photographic and written documentation of their crimes, apparently for distribution to other members and possibly for sale to collectors of such materials. The Morrison family photographs were part of this documentation system. Agent Martinez managed to track down a former postal inspector who had been investigating mail-order distribution of illegal materials in the early 1980s. He remembered intercepting packages that contained photographs similar to what we'd found in the Morrison case. The materials were being sent to addresses across the country, suggesting a network of customers who were purchasing documentation of real crimes. The postal inspector had tried to investigate further, but the operation had suddenly ceased in late 1983. The timing wasn't coincidental. 1983 was the year Francis Herrera died. Without their primary acquisition team, the entire network had apparently dissolved. Linda Watson had disappeared shortly after Francis's death, and the other participants had gone underground or moved on to different criminal activities. For 20 years, the evidence of their crimes had been scattered across multiple storage facilities and forgotten properties. As we delved deeper into the network's operations, we began to understand the full scope of what the Morrison family had endured. They hadn't just been kidnapped and murdered, they had been sold to collectors who viewed human suffering as entertainment. The photographs documenting their final days had been distributed to strangers who had paid money to witness their terror and desperation. This revelation changed everything about how I viewed the case. The Morrison family hadn't simply been victims of 2 disturbed individuals acting on violent fantasies. They had been commodities in a marketplace that treated human lives as products to be acquired, documented, and consumed. The casual detachment in Linda's journal entries now made sense. She wasn't just observing their suffering, she was creating a product for customers who had paid for detailed documentation. The FBI's investigation into the network eventually identified 7 other families that had been victims of this operation. In each case, the pattern was similar. Middle-class families with young children taken during public events, where their disappearance could be attributed to accident or misadventure. The families were held in temporary facilities before being transported to remote locations where they were killed after extended periods of documented torture. What happened to the other members of the network remains unknown. The postal inspector's records had been destroyed in the 1990s as part of routine evidence disposal. Financial records older than 20 years had been purged from most banking systems. The people who had funded and participated in these crimes had successfully covered their tracks and disappeared into normal lives, carrying their secrets with them. Linda Watson was never found. The FBI issued federal warrants for her arrest, but she had been off the grid since 1983. Agent Martinez believed she had either died or assumed a completely new identity. Occasionally, we would receive tips from people who thought they had seen her, but none ever led anywhere. She had simply vanished as completely as the families she had helped destroy. In 2001, I made the decision to close my investigation into the Morrison case. After 6 years of work, we had answered most of the questions about what happened to the family, but the knowledge brought no comfort. David, Carol, Tommy, and Sarah Morrison had suffered unimaginably during their final days. They had died knowing that no one was coming to save them, that their children would never grow up, that their lives had been stolen by people who viewed them as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. The Morrison house in White Plains was demolished in 2003. The new owners said they couldn't live there, knowing what had happened to the previous residents. A small park was built on the lot, with a memorial bench dedicated to the memory of the family. Sometimes I drive by that park and sit on the bench, thinking about how different things might have been if Francis Herrera had received proper treatment for his psychological problems, or if someone had noticed the pattern of disappearances earlier. Agent Martinez continued working cold cases until her retirement in 2015. She often said that the Morrison investigation had changed how she viewed human nature, that she never again underestimated what people were capable of doing to each other. The network we uncovered led to changes in how federal law enforcement agencies share information about missing persons cases, but those changes came too late to help the families who had already been lost. The photographs of the Morrison family remain in FBI evidence storage, along with Linda's journal and the other materials we collected during the investigation. Sometimes I wonder if there are other storage units out there, other hidden compartments containing evidence of crimes that no one has connected yet. The network had been operating for at least 4 years that we knew of, but there's no way to know when it actually started or how many victims there really were. What haunts me most is knowing that the people who funded and consumed the documentation of these crimes are probably still alive. They're living normal lives, perhaps with families of their own, carrying the secret knowledge of what they participated in during the 1970s and early 1980s. They were never caught, never prosecuted, never forced to face the consequences of their actions. They simply walked away when the operation collapsed and blended back into society. The Morrison case taught me that evil doesn't always wear an obvious face. Sometimes it looks like a quiet neighbor, a helpful stranger, or a concerned citizen offering assistance during a crisis. Francis Herrera and Linda Watson were able to operate for years because they understood how to exploit people's natural trust and willingness to help others. They turned our basic human decency against us, using our own compassion as a weapon. The discovery of the criminal network opened doors to investigations I never could have imagined. In 2002, 3 years after officially closing the Morrison case, I received a call that would pull me back into the darkest corners of this story. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic psychologist working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, had been studying the materials we'd uncovered and believed there were patterns we had missed. Dr. Vance had spent months analyzing Linda Watson's journal entries, not just for content, but for psychological markers that might reveal more about the network's structure. She discovered that Linda's writing style changed dramatically after certain entries, suggesting she was copying information from someone else's notes or following detailed instructions. The clinical detachment wasn't just Linda's personality. She was following a specific protocol developed by someone with extensive knowledge of psychological manipulation. This wasn't amateur hour, Dr. Vance explained during our first meeting. Someone with advanced training in psychology and possibly medicine was directing these operations. The progression of psychological torture documented in the journal follows patterns used in military and intelligence interrogation programs. Whoever designed this system understood exactly how to break down a person's mental defenses systematically. This revelation led us to examine Francis Herrera's military records more carefully. His psychological operations unit in Vietnam had been involved in programs that were later declassified as part of government mind control experiments. Francis hadn't just been a disturbed veteran. He had been trained in psychological manipulation techniques by the US military. Someone had weaponized his training and directed it toward innocent families. Following this lead, Agent Martinez and I began investigating other veterans from Francis's unit who had returned to civilian life in the mid-1970s. Of the 12 men who had served in the same psychological operations company, 4 had died by 1985, 3 had moved overseas, and 2 had been institutionalized for severe psychiatric disorders. That left 3 who were unaccounted for in the normal record system. One name kept appearing in connection with various shell companies and rental agreements during the late 1970s, Dr. Marcus Steinberg. Military records showed he had been Francis's commanding officer and had supervised the psychological operations program. After his discharge in 1972, Steinberg had briefly worked for a private defense contractor before disappearing from official records. His medical degree and military experience would have made him perfectly suited to design and oversee the kind of operation we had uncovered. The search for Dr. Steinberg led us into the shadowy world of government contractors and classified programs that operated with minimal oversight during the Cold War era. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional hearings, we learned that several former military personnel had been recruited for private research projects that operated outside normal legal boundaries. These projects were funded by anonymous clients and conducted in facilities that officially didn't exist. In 2003, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former secretary who had worked for one of these contractor companies contacted the FBI after seeing a television documentary about the Morrison case. She recognized Dr. Steinberg's photograph and remembered typing reports about acquisition and containment protocols for something called Project Mirror. The project had been active from 1975 to 1983 and had involved multiple teams operating in different regions of the country. Project Mirror's documents, which the secretary had secretly copied before the company was dissolved, revealed the true scope of the network we had been investigating. It wasn't just a criminal operation, it was a systematic program designed to test psychological manipulation techniques on unwilling subjects. The families who were kidnapped weren't just victims of violence, they were test subjects in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The documentation showed that Francis and Linda's team was just one of several acquisition units operating across the United States. Each team was responsible for capturing specific types of families that met predetermined criteria. The families were then subjected to various psychological torture protocols, while detailed measurements were taken of their responses. The data was compiled into reports that were sold to private clients, whose identities were protected by multiple layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Dr. Steinberg had apparently designed Project Mirror as a way to monetize research that could no longer be conducted under government oversight. After congressional investigations into CIA mind control programs in the mid-1970s, official funding for such research had been terminated. But the demand for information about psychological manipulation techniques remained high among certain private clients who were willing to pay enormous sums for detailed data. The Morrison family photographs took on new meaning when viewed in this context. They weren't just documentation of a crime, They were data points in a scientific experiment. The careful progression from confusion to terror to complete psychological breakdown had been orchestrated to provide measurable results. Linda's journal wasn't just the recording of a disturbed observer. It was a research protocol being followed by someone trained to document psychological responses. Agent Martinez and I spent 2 years tracking down other properties and storage facilities connected to Project Mirror. In total, we found evidence relating to 14 families who had been victims of the program. The Brennan, Kowalski, and Chen families that we had identified earlier were just the beginning. There were also the Rodriguez family from Miami, the Johnson family from Denver, the Park family from Seattle, and others whose names I still cannot speak without feeling sick. Each family had been selected for specific characteristics that made them ideal test subjects. Middle-class stability suggested they would have strong family bonds that could be systematically destroyed. The presence of children allowed researchers to study how psychological torture affected different age groups. The family's regular routines and public activities made them easy to surveil and capture without arousing suspicion from law enforcement. The most horrifying discovery was a series of progress reports that Dr. Steinberg had prepared for his clients. These documents described in clinical terms how long it took to break down different types of people, which techniques were most effective at inducing compliance, and how family bonds could be weaponized to increase psychological trauma. Children were found to be particularly effective leverage for controlling parents, while parents' desperation to protect their children provided rich data about human decision-making under extreme stress. We found evidence that some families had been kept alive for months, moved between different facilities as their psychological conditions were monitored and documented. The Morrison family's 3-day ordeal was relatively brief, compared to some victims who had endured weeks or even months of systematic torture before being killed. The variation in timeframes appeared to be related to specific research goals rather than random cruelty. In 2004, I located Dr. Steinberg living under an assumed name in Costa Rica. He had been operating a small medical clinic in a remote village, apparently trying to atone for his past by providing health care to impoverished communities. When confronted with the evidence of Project Mirror, he initially denied everything. But faced with overwhelming documentation and the threat of extradition, he eventually agreed to provide information in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Dr. Steinberg's confession revealed details that even our extensive investigation had not uncovered. Project Mirror had been funded by a consortium of clients that included foreign intelligence agencies, private military contractors, and wealthy individuals with interests in psychological manipulation research. The total funding had exceeded $20 million over 8 years, making it one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises of its kind. The clients had specific research interests that determined which families were selected and what types of experiments were conducted. Some wanted data about breaking down family structures for potential military applications. Others were interested in techniques for controlling prisoners or hostages. A few appeared to be simply wealthy sadists who paid premium prices to watch recordings of the torture sessions. Dr. Steinberg provided the names of other personnel who had been involved in Project Mirror, including medical professionals who had monitored the victim's health, technicians who had operated the recording equipment, and administrative staff who had managed the financial aspects of the operation. Most of these individuals had been compartmentalized, knowing only their specific role without understanding the full scope of the program. The investigation expanded to include international cooperation as we traced the flow of money and information to clients in multiple countries. Swiss bank records revealed payments to Project Mirror from accounts connected to intelligence agencies in 3 different nations. Shipping records showed that videotapes and documents had been sent to addresses in Europe, Asia, and South America. Law enforcement agencies in 12 countries eventually became involved in the investigation. Arrests were made in Germany, where a former intelligence officer had been selling Project Mirror data to terrorist organizations. Similar arrests followed in Japan, Argentina, and the Netherlands as the international scope of the criminal network became clear. Despite these successes, many questions remained unanswered. The identities of the highest-level clients were protected by layers of legal and financial barriers that proved impossible to penetrate. The total number of victims could only be estimated, as records had been deliberately destroyed when Project Mirror was terminated in 1983. Most disturbing, we found evidence that similar programs had continued operating after Project Mirror ended, suggesting that Dr. Steinberg's organization was just one part of a larger industry. Linda Watson was never found, despite international manhunts and rewards totaling over $1 million. Dr. Steinberg claimed that she had been eliminated by the program's security team when Project Mirror was shut down, but no body was ever recovered. Agent Martinez believed that Linda had successfully disappeared into a new identity and might still be alive somewhere, possibly continuing to operate under different circumstances. The legal proceedings that followed took nearly a decade to complete. Dr. Steinberg's cooperation led to prosecutions in multiple jurisdictions, but many of the key figures had died or disappeared by the time they could be located. The families of the victims pursued civil lawsuits against government agencies and private contractors, resulting in settlements that totaled hundreds of millions of dollars but could never truly compensate for their losses. The Morrison family's extended relatives, who had hired me to investigate the case in 1995, established a foundation dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and funding research into organized crime networks. They said that knowing the truth about what happened was both devastating and healing. Devastating to learn the extent of David, Carol, Tommy, and Sarah's suffering, but healing to finally have answers after decades of uncertainty. In 2010, 15 years after beginning my investigation into the Morrison case, I published a book about Project Mirror and its victims. The book was controversial, with some critics arguing that revealing details about psychological torture techniques could inspire copycat crimes. Others praised it for exposing a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years and for honoring the memory of the families who had been victims. The book's publication led to additional tips and information from people who had suspected involvement in similar programs. 3 more families were identified as likely victims of Project Mirror or related operations. Cold case investigators in several states reopened investigations based on the patterns we had identified. While most of these cases remained unsolved, families finally had explanations for disappearances that had haunted them for decades. I retired from private investigation in 2012, but I continue to receive calls from law enforcement agencies and families dealing with similar cases. The techniques developed for Project Mirror have apparently been adapted and used by other criminal organizations, making it an ongoing law enforcement challenge. Human trafficking networks, terrorist organizations, and even some corporations have adopted elements of the psychological manipulation protocols that Dr. Steinberg designed. The Morrison case changed how I view the world and the people in it. Before this investigation, I believed that extreme evil was rare and easily identifiable. I learned that sophisticated criminal operations can hide behind facades of legitimacy and respectability. People with advanced education and professional credentials can commit atrocities that exceed anything imagined by common criminals. The banality of evil, as one philosopher called it, is perhaps more frightening than dramatic displays of violence. Sometimes I drive past the Memorial Park, where the Morrison house once stood, and think about the randomness of their selection as victims. They were chosen not for anything they had done, but simply because they represented ideal test subjects for a psychological experiment. Their deaths served no higher purpose, advanced no cause, and benefited no one except wealthy clients who paid to witness their suffering. The case also taught me about the resilience of families who refused to give up searching for missing loved ones. The Morrison relatives who hired me never stopped believing that answers existed, even when official investigations had been closed for years. Their persistence ultimately led to the exposure of a criminal network that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. What disturbs me most about the Project Mirror revelations is the knowledge that similar operations probably continue to exist. The technology for surveillance and documentation has improved dramatically since the 1970s and 1980s. The demand for information about psychological manipulation remains high among certain clients. The combination of advanced surveillance capabilities and international money laundering systems creates opportunities for criminal networks that dwarf anything Project Mirror accomplished. Agent Martinez, now retired, often says that the Morrison case represents both the best and worst of human nature. The worst is obvious, the calculated cruelty of people who treated innocent families as laboratory subjects. The best is represented by the investigators, prosecutors, and family members who refused to let these crimes remain hidden and who worked tirelessly to ensure that the victims were remembered and their stories told.